line graph with events in numerics is the tool in level specifically designed to aid in the control of blood glucose levels by type 1 diabetics. The glucose level in your blood is struck as a balance of conflicting forces between the insulin driving the blood glucose level down and the food that you eat driving it up. If these are balanced, then your blood glucose reading will be in your target zone. If you have too much insulin, not enough food, which is why you can never actually skip a meal if you are injecting insulin, then you will reach a coma status or hypoglycemia, and that is your blood glucose readings will be below your target zone. If on the other hand, you eat too much food or your insulin injections are inadequate, then your blood sugar readings will go higher than your target zone. So when they're out of your target zone, you want to make some kind of adjustment. So this graph, the line graph with events in numerics, is a learning tool to aid you in ascertaining what is the correct amount of food to eat, balanced with the correct amount of insulin to inject to stay within the target zone. So let's examine a few examples of how this particular graph can help you decide what it is that needs to be adjusted. So under blood glucose levels, we will go to a line graph with events and numerics. There is some test data to illustrate the point about to be made, and it is contained in January on the day 4 in the year 1997. And stopping on January 5 in the year 1997. This graph is most useful when you put 2 or 3 days data on the screen at a time. It is designed for detailed analysis for specific time periods involving hours. Whenever you change your date or you want to ask Level to give you a new presentation, then you click on Redraw and you will get the new graph. This is an example of the line graph with events and numerics. This one is mistyped, it should be January. So let's redraw. And this is the first example that we wish to make. I'll illustrate this graph in outline. First, the line graph is simply your blood glucose reading as you measured it with your meter at various times throughout the day. We have 2 days on the screen, so you see you are taking readings around 4 or 5 times a day, which is approximately average. Some of the readings are in your target zone, some are not in your target zone. So the idea is to ascertain what you can do, adjustments you can make, to get them in the target zone. Since your glucose reading is a balance between the insulin that you inject and the food that you eat, then whenever you take a reading, or at any other time throughout the day, you can record the food that you ate and the insulin that you inject, and those recordings will appear on this graph as data above the graph. And by moving the timeline, you can see what happened at any particular time. For example, if we put the timeline here, we're at 6:42 a.m. Sunday. Your blood glucose reading was 107, which is right in your target zone. Now, when you recorded this reading, you also indicated that it was taken at breakfast, and you also injected 27 units of regular and 12 units of long-term NPH. You also ate 53 grams of carbs, 16 grams of fats, 454 calories, and 17 grams of proteins. It is important that you enter these 4 food items at these times that you need to make some kind of adjustment. Your carbs, your fats, your calories, and your proteins. These are entered along with a reading just for this particular analysis. Once your readings are in your target zone and you're going along fine, then you do not need this level of detail. But if your readings start to jump out of your target zone, then you want to spend some time with this level of detail, and every reading that you take to enter your carbs, fats, calories, and proteins so that you can compare and see exactly what it is between the balance between the insulin and the food that is failing. Now, for this particular reading here, I believe we can see what happened. This reading is high, and if we go back to see what happened here at this lunchtime, we see that the person ate 343 grams of carbohydrate, which is excessive to what they would be eating in order to have good readings. So immediately what happened is the 343 grams of carbohydrates put them into a high reading up around 180. And the short-term insulin was not dosed to handle that amount of carbohydrates. The insulin is dosed to handle a prescribed amount of intake that you will have, and you must adhere to that both on the side of the insulin and on the side of the intake to attain the balance. As you see, what happens is that the body digests the carbohydrates, the long-term insulin has its effect, and the readings come back down. And they continue to be fairly acceptable until the next morning. When we come to this time, 6:42 a.m. Monday, the next day, we have again a good blood glucose reading, 107. This is your fasting reading as soon as you got up. But look what happened immediately after that. The next reading taken at 8:41 is dangerously low, down around 50. Let's see exactly why that is. If you will observe, this person skipped breakfast. They had 54 calories, 3 grams of protein, and 23 grams of carb for their breakfast. In other words, they basically skipped their breakfast, but they injected their insulin. The insulin continued to act, and it drove them dangerously low. So this graph illustrates clearly the dangers of doing excessive carbohydrates and the dangers of skipping your breakfast. And it will tell you the adjustments to make very clearly. The next data item is on January 8th and 9th. On these 2 days, you see that the person is ingesting the desired amount of food. The carbs are right in line with their plan, the fats and the calories every meal, and the total protein spread throughout the day. So their food intake is as prescribed, but their readings are systematically high. If their readings are systematically high, but their food is as designed, then the change is obvious what they must do. Simply the insulin dosages must be categorically increased, both short-term and long-term, to bring the readings down. So the next data, let's look at 14 and 15 to illustrate this next point. This next point is a counterexample. Here, once again, the food is right in line with what it should be, both the fats, the carbs, the calories, and the proteins. However, the readings are systematically low. So for this particular individual, the adjustment is that the insulin dosages must be categorically reduced to bring you back up into the target zone. So the third data will be on 17 and 18. See if we can decipher from this graph, analyzing the insulin that's injected and the food that is ingested throughout the day with the readings, and to see what kind of adjustment that we should make. What is happening is at fasting, the reading was a little bit high. And then the insulin was injected, the 23 and the 10. And so the insulin, short-term insulin brought the reading back down. It was effective. But what happens is if you wait another few hours, the reading goes right back up again. And so this time they injected some short-term and it went back down. And it stayed down for a few hours, then it went back up again. So every time they inject the short-term, it goes down. Now, their food items are right as they should be. There is no over or under on the food items. So their food items is not causing these high readings. What is causing these high readings is insufficient long-term, because the short-term is acting as it should to reduce the reading, but in a few hours the short-term has worn off. And then it's the job of the long-term insulin to keep the reading down until the next short-term injection, but the reading is going back up. So the conclusion here is to increase the amount of NPH long-term insulin. Let's look at the next item on 21 and 22. Here we can see we have sort of the opposite effect. The person's fasting reading is fine. They eat a normal breakfast, and they inject 18 units of regular, 12 units of long-term, and immediately after breakfast, which is a normal breakfast, nothing wrong with that, their reading goes high. So it goes high, and then the food wears off, and the reading drops back down into the target zone, and they eat some more food, and they inject some more regular, but their reading goes back up. So what's happening is every time they eat some food, their reading goes back up. It's the job of the short-term insulin to keep the reading down immediately after eating. The short-term insulin is insufficient in dosage, but after the meal wears off, the long-term insulin is taking the reading back down. So the conclusion from this graph is that the long-term insulin is doing its job. And as soon as the effect of the meal wears off, the long-term insulin is taking the readings back to the target zone. But when they come up to the next meal, then the calories and protein, carbs, and fats are ingested, along with the short-term insulin, whose job is to keep the effects of the meal down, and the short-term insulin is failing to keep the effect of the meal down. And so, and only until the meal is ingested does the reading go back down. So the conclusion here is that the long-term insulin dosage is fine and the short-term is insufficient. So these sample graphs are shown to illustrate the analytical power of the line graph with events in numerics. When you put on the same screen your insulin dosages, your carbs, fats, calories, and proteins above the blood glucose readings as it's tracked in time during 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 days, then you can see and analyze which is failing and which is working. So this is a powerful graph aimed specifically at the hour-by-hour analysis that needs to be performed by a type 1 diabetic when their readings go out of the target zone. This happens, unfortunately, without sometimes understanding as to why it does happen, so an analysis of this type is needed. Also, for a recently diagnosed type 1 diabetic who is learning how to adjust their meals and insulin so as to stay within the target zone, then this graph is also called for at that time. After the adjustments have been made and your readings are staying within your target zone, then you do not need to analyze at this level of detail until they once again, at some later time, call for this level of analysis. So this is used when needed. Just to point out that the way that these carbs, fats, and proteins get entered in is when you make a blood glucose reading, then you will enter the amount of the blood glucose reading either directly or it will come in through your meter. At the same time that either you make the reading enter directly or that it comes in through your meter, then you are also allowed to type in certain amounts of insulin that you have ingested at this same time, and you are also to type in the grams of carbs, the grams of fats, the calories, and the grams of protein. Now, you will track these 4 food items in if you are planning to use line graph with events in numerics, and then they will appear on the graph. If you download your data from a meter, then at the time of the download, this screen also appears for each reading, and you can embellish the actual blood glucose reading with these 4 numbers, which you have kept in notes. Because most meters do not have internal data keeping capability rich enough to store the carbs, fats, calories, and proteins. If your meter does, then it can be punched into the meter and downloaded. Otherwise, you should take the notes whenever you take the reading, and when you do download the meter at a later time, then you can refer to your notes and enter these numbers at that time. Also, if you want, you can make your entries directly into this screen without downloading your meter at all. Sometimes you eat food without taking a reading. So then you come to this screen and you enter your carbs, fats, calories, and proteins without a blood glucose level. And then you simply save that without the blood glucose level, and other ones may have a blood glucose reading. So it is with this entry throughout the day that you record your food intake, and you also embellish your blood glucose readings as they came in through the meter. So this illustrates the line graph with events in numerics, which is the primary tool in level for type 1 diabetes to use when they need to make some kind of change in the balance between their insulin and food intake.